Welcome to OCF's Community Connections session, focused on meaningful investments in Indigenous communities. My name is Kirsten Kilchenstein, and I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer at OCF, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm so pleased to have OCF board member Bobby Connor with us today. Bobby is the director of Tamastlet Cultural Institute, the tribally owned museum located in Pendleton, Oregon on the Umatilla Reservation. Before moving home to Pendleton in 1997, Bobby worked for the U.S. Small Business Administration for 13 years, starting as a presidential management intern. And then over that time, she moved to she departed that tenure as the director, Sacramento District Director post. Bobby is Cayuse, Umatilla, and Nez Perce, and is enrolled at the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla. She's the vice chair of Eastern Oregon University's inaugural board of trustees, is on the EcoTrust board of directors, and serves on the Wallowa-based Tamastlet Celebration Committee. She chaired the board of trustees for the National Museum of American Indian in 2012 and 2013 during service from 2008 to 2014. She also served on the board of directors for the American Alliance of Museums from 2008 to 2014. Phew, that's a lot. As you might imagine, we are all thrilled to have Bobby serving and bringing her expertise to the OCF board of directors. Bobby?
Thank you, Kirsten. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement today. So I ask you, if you're comfortable doing so, to stand in honor of the ancestors who have come before us, as well as our current Indigenous populations, and the land that they have stewarded so carefully and lovingly. Indigenous peoples have long held the land itself in great reverence. Utilizing these long-standing traditions, we would like to acknowledge the land upon which we currently stand. This land has created a vibrant and loving home for us, and we give thanks to the tribes who have been its stewards since the beginning of time. While we are grateful for our ability to reside in this beautiful state, we acknowledge that we must still work toward the essential justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and co-liberation that will help our state thrive, one that will truly feel like home to all who inhabit here. We would like to acknowledge all Indigenous people of the lands encompassed by the current state of Oregon, as we know it today, including our 9 federally recognized tribes and our urban Indian or Indigenous populations. We honor and thank both the ancestors and the descendants of the Burns Paiute tribe, the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Indians, the Coquel Indian Tribe, and the Klamath Tribes for being the original stewards and protectors of these lands since the beginning of time. We acknowledge the attempt to eradicate tribal populations through systemic policies of genocide, relocation, termination, and assimilation, which still impact many Indigenous families today. We are honored by the collective efforts of many Indigenous nations, leaders, and families who continue to pass on their many strengths and traditions, demonstrating resilience, resistance, revitalization, healing, and creativity. We are honored to be visitors upon these lands and to work in partnership with these Native communities comprised of individuals who stand over 5 million strong in the United States today. We extend our heartfelt gratitude to both the ancestors and the descendants of these tribes, as well as our community partners here today, for sharing our vision for a better Oregon. Thank you, and you may be seated if you are standing.
Thank you so much, Bobby. And thanks to all of you for joining us to learn more about efforts to sustain and preserve tradition, provide mutual support, and promote equitable and effective philanthropy in Native communities. Oregon is home to a diversity of Native peoples with wide-ranging backgrounds and traditions. Today's session is intended to be a starting point for learning and engaging more deeply, and we're thrilled at the attendance today. We're grateful for today's speakers, Paul and Eric, the incredible work they do locally and nationally, and for their time to share knowledge and insight with us today. Thank you to everyone joining us on this webinar for your partnership with OCF, your generosity, and the many ways you support community-led change and impactful giving throughout the state. It's my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Shay Kuzma. Shay's work at OCF supports thriving and accessible arts communities across Oregon via OCF's Arts and Culture portfolio. As an enrolled member of the Gitskan Nation, Shay brings a background in working with Indigenous communities, as well as public policy experience to her role at the foundation. And now I'll turn it over to Shay.
Thank you, Kirsten. I appreciate the introduction. Amahoksa, good afternoon. As Kirsten said, I'm Shay Kuzma, and I will be here today on this journey and learning experience. So at first, I would like to go ahead and introduce our first panelist, Paul Lumley. Paul is the Executive Director for the Native American Youth and Family Center, or as we know it, NAYA, and is a citizen of the Yakama Nation. He came to NAYA in 2016 after being the Executive Director of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission since 2009. Paul served as the Executive Director of the National American Indian Housing Council in Washington, D.C. from 2007 to 2009. And while also in D.C., served as the Senior Tribal Liaison for the U.S. Department of Defense from 2004 to 2007. From 1987 to 2004, Paul served under several capacities at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. Paul has a wide-ranging background on issues that directly impact Native communities. He has worked directly with tribal governments, tribal consortia, virtually all federal agencies impacting Indian country, and Native American national and regional organizations throughout his professional career. His areas of expertise include tribal treaty rights, environmental protection and restoration, housing, defense, education, and social services. We're so grateful to Paul for sharing NAYA's innovative work and his perspectives and expertise in intertribal collaboration, policy, and housing with the OCF community. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Paul. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Che, for the introduction, and also thank you, Bobby, for that wonderful land acknowledgement. So yes, I grew up on the Yakama Reservation, which is located in central Washington State, but I also spent quite a bit of time on the Columbia River fishing. Come from a big fishing family, also in the mountains quite a bit, hunting and hiking and just enjoying the summertime when I was growing up. So it had a lot of really happy times. But also had a very difficult childhood at the same time. Moved around quite a bit. By the time I was 21 years old, I'd lived in at least 21 different cities. And I was homeless off and on between the years of 15 and 23. But somehow in this journey of life, I sort of lifted myself up and entered into this, this career that I would never have expected, that ended up me being at the Native American Youth and Family Center as their CEO, something that I never thought would ever happen. I have known NAYA for, probably a couple of decades in my support to them. I funded some of their programs through my work at the Fish Commission, donated, went to their galas, and we just had our gala on Friday, so it was pretty cool. But I never thought I'd have the great honor of being their executive director, and it really is a humbling experience. And I have to say that the reason why it's so humbling is, after I got into NAYA, I got to learn more about all of their programming and hadn't realized that I could have benefited from almost every one of their programs. I even went to an alternative high school, and NAYA has one of those. We have an alternative high school called the Many Nations Academy through our partnership with the Portland Public Schools. which is an amazing partnership, by the way. And we save Native kids. It's a great program. We also have a lot of wraparound services. I don't know, Che, if you're able to upload the brochure I sent you yesterday, but hopefully it's in the materials. You can open up the brochure and see all the different departments we have at NIN, all the different programs that we have to serve these kids. You know, we really try to do everything we can to remove all the barriers to these kids so they can graduate successfully and also have a future for a career or college. It's a wonderful program. You know, one of the things we hadn't expected was how needy these kids would be. Like me, many of them are homeless. We range anywhere from 25 to 45% of these kids are homeless. Many have a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, with involvement with gangs or drug and alcohol, or come from broken families or families dealing with domestic violence. A lot of the kids that come to us are foster kids or kids that have been terribly bullied in high school for being LGBTQ. So we offer a safe place for these kids to thrive and succeed. And when we started doing this high school, really, I think it's 12 or 13 years ago, we decided also to branch out these same services to the community. So these same wraparound services are now offered throughout the Native community in Portland. So NAIA grew quite a bit, but one thing we never forgot was that we are youth-centered, family-driven, and elder-guided. That part has never changed. And while we are also helping the neediest in the community, we're also trying to give people hope. And we want to lift the community out of poverty. And we're doing that by offering affordable housing, giving the community opportunities for college and career and business opportunities. So just doing everything we can to help them also help themselves. So that's a little bit about who NAIA is. And before the event today, I was asked to touch on a couple of topics. And one of them is some of my experiences in collaborating with tribes, which I've done throughout Oregon, throughout the nation, actually. And a lot of my work at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. So, you know, I'm 58 years old, and in my professional career, you know, I've been working for tribal nations or with them the entire time. And I've just really seen the power of a collaboration, how effective it really works. You know, I was, as mentioned earlier, I was the executive director of the National American Indian Housing Council in Washington, D.C., and I saw these groups come through, and some had you know, really clear collaborations, the same voice, speaking with the same voice, so powerful. I saw other groups coming through that were not doing that as much and not getting as far. And so I really saw the power of that collaboration, and I really wanted to take that sort of learning that I got in DC back home when I moved back here to Portland area after living in DC for 5 years. And I actually came back to the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. I started there in, let's say it was 1986, as a summer intern sampling fish out at Bonneville Dam, and eventually their executive director when I came back from DC. So I took the whole spectrum there. And in that experience I had with collaborations and working directly with groups of tribes, you know, I focused on the Oregon tribes, also in tribes throughout the Pacific Northwest, and we got a lot done. It was amazing. We got a lot done in Washington, D.C. when I was at the Housing Council too. That power of speaking with one voice. You know, we had 480 tribes that we represented our membership at the Housing Council in D.C., and we got a lot of legislation passed. So, so I came back. I wanted to see more of that. We definitely did that working with the tribes on fisheries, certainly through the 4 tribes of the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, but also we branched out to 15 tribes in the Columbia River Basin, and I think made a lot of progress. You know, one of the things I also never forgot about was, you know, where I grew up. You know, I grew up not just on the Yakima Rest, but also on the Columbia River fishing. So it's a big, you know, fishing family. And I saw how our people were living, and it was truly a housing crisis that had been going on for a long time. And you know, when I was doing that work in DC, traveling nationally, I saw some, you know, pretty atrocious housing, but the worst I ever saw was actually right here in my backyard. It was, you know, out at Lone Pine, and just, you know, right there in the city of the Dalles. Worst housing I ever saw nationally, right there. And the most atrocious part is living in the shadow of the Dalles Dam, which made that housing crisis. They dislocated those, our people in the area. Yeah, wouldn't even give them free electricity, much less a house. And so I made it my mission to try and took what I learned in DC and try to fix this. So now we have the 4 tribes are advocating strongly for the Corps of Engineers to provide some replacement housing as a result of the construction of the Dalles Dam. Tribes got that under control. But the part that I picked up on was creating a new organization, a new entity. And we did it. And it's called Inchiwana Housing. Inchiwana is the Itchiskeem word for Big River. So it's Big River Housing. And we launched as a 501c3 this past summer, which is pretty exciting. I've been working on it for, well, really since about 2016. Because so to see this finally come to fruition is something I'm very proud of. We're currently still the fiscal sponsor of Inchiwana Housing. NEA is a fiscal sponsor because we're waiting for the letter from the IRS to give us that final determination. But I'm so proud of the work that we've already been able to accomplish. We hired our executive director last year in February, and then of course what happened, the pandemic started, but they've been able to accomplish quite a bit in this first year and a half. And I'm just so proud of that team that came together. And now we have Inchiwana Housing, which is going to address the immediate housing needs of the people on the Columbia River. So, back to NEA, wanted to also give you some reference points on the community that we serve in the Portland area. And some of you may be aware of these references of, an urban tribal community or a rural tribal community. So Portland definitely has a large population of natives in the urban community. And then most of the rural tribal communities, those are actually under the tribal government based programming. So that there, as you know, there are 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. Most of them have rights in Oregon, but there's others that, actually all of them have rights in Oregon, but some tribes also have rights when they're actually not located in Oregon, like my tribe, Yakima. We have fishing rights at Willamette Falls, for example. So some of your work in Oregon, some of you might be surprised that there are other tribes that have rights also in areas of Oregon. So anyway, though, the rural tribal communities are generally covered by the tribal government programming and also how they govern themselves. They're a part of that whole governance structure, which is quite a bit different in an urban community like Portland. So at NEA, we counted 380 tribal affiliations amongst our staff and clients. So we have a very broad group. Some come from tribal reservations like I did, some come from the urban environment their entire life. But one thing we have in common is that we typically don't get served by our own tribe. They serve the tribal communities in their reservation areas, but not in urban areas like Portland. And so there's a little bit of being left out. And so organizations like NEA step in to do what we can with a broad range of government, mainstream government and foundation and other kinds of giving to bring services to the urban Indian community here. NEA is not the only organization. There's another organization that we partner with quite a bit, the Native American Rehabilitation Association. They're an amazing partner of NEA. We help they help the community be healthier as well. There's also an interesting comparison to the tribal community along the Columbia River. They also are not on reservation. They're a rural Indian community, but they're like sort of like an urban community too, because they're not served by tribal governments. And so we need to do what we can to help serve them. And that's why it was so important to start Inchiwana Housing, so we can get some services directly to them where tribes are not able to serve them directly because of the way they're funded by primarily the federal government. So we're very diverse, obviously, here in the Portland's urban tribal community as well as the Columbia River tribal community. We also have the same pride. We have pride in traditions and pride in our tribal cultural values and who we are as Indian people. That has never faltered, but we are sort of pushed together in these unusual ways when it comes to history. I was also asked to talk about some of our affordable tribal housing development that NAIA is doing. And back when I was in DC, I'd heard about NAIA getting involved in tribal housing. I just thought that was so wonderful. And when I came back, I had found out that they had gotten involved in several affordable housing developments, which I thought was fantastic because in my experience as a tribal leader nationally for tribal housing, I knew that there was some federal law there that would benefit, and we could actually do tribal preference in some of our affordable housing. And the reason why we could do that is because we had legislation that for tribal governments they were waived from the Fair Housing Act for Native preference, and it was specifically through the Indian Housing Block Grant. Now, most of the tribal programs are on reservation, most of their housing programs, but the interesting model here was that we were opening up an affordable housing property right by NAIA called Nasaika Ilihi, and it's 59 units. And I was really interested in offering tribal preference, and because I had some of my connections still from DC, I ended up having a really productive conversation with the Siletz tribe. And we were able to bring them in as an investor in a tax credit project. And in doing so, they extended their Native preference with their federal housing dollars. They extended that to the partnership, to NAIA, a nonprofit. So we introduced a Native preference for the first time to Portland, which was amazing. We had, of those 59 units, we leased up at 93% were tribal families, which is beyond our wildest dreams. And one of our other affordable housing properties, before I started anyway, one of our projects, they leased up at only 5% tribal families. So it's because we had to comply with the Fair Housing Act. So we know we can do better when we have a partnership with the tribe, and we have a really good partnership with the Siletz tribe. There's no question about it. I had no idea that this model that we had put together would be so hard until I realized, or somebody explained to me, that this has never been done before in the United States. I thought for surely it had, but it hadn't. And so that's why it was so hard. And I feel like I aged 10 years in about 6 months. In fact, there's an interesting photograph of everybody's got a shovel for doing the groundbreaking, and I have this really big smile on my face. But in the back of my head, I'm screaming because I know the project no longer pencils out because we ran into a problem with affordable housing. My gosh, these programs are so complicated, but we're able to piece it all together, and the project didn't fall apart. But I was sweating bullets there for a while, and we had a beautiful ribbon cutting ceremony, and the building looks great. The theme there is it's a recovery house. It's a place where families and individuals come to recover from drug and alcohol addiction, or those that have mental health supports that they need. Strong partnership also with the Native American Rehabilitation Association, and our affordable housing developer, our partnership there is called Community Development Partners, and they've been really good for us as well. In fact, so good that we were doing another one, and it's called Unmet Opportunities, also on the same street, 42nd Avenue, both of them right by NAIA. So we have the Siletz tribe's investment again, so we'll have tribal preference there. The theme for this building is affordable housing for artists and affordable housing for natives. So we're going to have some native artists there and a focus on that. Both buildings have really profound exterior art that is native. When you drive by, you cannot be mistaken. That is a tribal building. And that art is exterior and also throughout the entire interior for both buildings. Mamuktokuti will be leasing up here either by the end of the year or in January. We'll start that process. So, one of the things also that, I never forgotten about is, we need to do more in terms of bringing together community. And with these two affordable housing projects so close to NAIA and on the same street, there's a little business district right there too. We are proposing to have a cultural arts corridor that connects the buildings and connects us to NAIA, because we want to do more than just serve the neediest of the needy. We want to provide opportunities for business in that business district for Natives. We want to give all these Native families moving to this neighborhood a sense of home, a sense of place, to express themselves proudly to the city. We are a Native community, and we're expressing ourselves through Indigenous art. So, that's really important to us. And so, I would think that probably in 2 or 3 years' time, if we're successful, you'll see public art that's Native, unmistakably a Native community. So, just a few more comments in closing, at least. In my 5 years at NAIA, I would say that the potential there is really truly amazing. We do have our limitations. We have a lot of government funding that comes in from the county and the city and the state, and federal funding through housing, but none of them want to fund the building that we're in, at least in terms of our mortgage. Everybody loves our space. Love to come there for these meetings and great big conferences and use our space. It's a 10-acre campus, and the back is incredibly beautiful. It butts up against the Columbia Slough watershed. It's gorgeous. I mean, there's eagles out there and hawks and bird life and turtles and lakes back there. It really truly is a gem. Everybody loves it, but nobody wants to pay for it. And when I started in 2016, I'll admit I cried a few times at my desk because they were in such financial hardship when I started. I didn't know if I could fix it. And we had people trying to buy the building out from under us. And I had to look at those offers and think, gosh, do we need to do that to save NAIA? Well, we survived that, but I made it a mission of mine to never allow NAIA to get in that spot again. So we have a little campaign. It's called Return to Near Chokiku. It's not huge. It's only 5 million. I think we're about getting close to halfway there. If we get this big grant from the state, we'll see. But we're making some progress on it. Near Chokiku is the name of a tribal village in the area where NAIA currently is, and it was a fishing village. And so, we want to honor that tribal village. We want to honor the Native community. We want this NAIA campus to always be here for the Native community in perpetuity. That's something that I am committed to doing while I am the CEO of the Native American Youth and Family Center. Something I want to see happen. The remaining portions of that campaign are primarily on retiring the debt. It's something that is so hard to fund, but if you know of anybody that can assist us, please get a hold of me. I'd be more than happy to have a conversation about that. Also, if you'd like to learn more about NAIA, you can go to our website at naiapdx.org. And I also had sent a video to you, Shay, about the space behind NAIA. And we put together a little video about our food sovereignty initiative. And you can learn about all this food we're growing and medicinal plants for the Native community and a little bit more about NAIA. Well, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and close right here. And I'll be sticking around here for perhaps a little bit of question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. We are incredibly appreciative of the chance to hear more about your local work serving Native communities and your partnership with Oregon tribes. I must say that I'm always super excited to drive by those spaces that you were talking about, particularly the art space. So I appreciate you sharing that perspective and that information. So we will, as you said, we'll have some questions for you in the Q&A portion of our panel. So I do hope you stick around about NAIA's innovative work locally and your wide range of experiences partnering with tribal communities that you talked about. Next, we're so fortunate to also have Eric Stegman joining us from the only Native-led organization in the country, specifically focused on the philanthropic sector. So welcome, Eric. Eric's family is from the Carry the Kettle Nakota Nation, and Eric is the Chief Executive Officer of Native Americans in Philanthropy, a national organization advocating for stronger and more meaningful investments by the philanthropic sector in tribal communities. Previously, Eric served as the Executive Director for the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute, Majority Staff Counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, and in the Obama administration as a policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Education. Eric began his career in Washington, D.C. at the National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center, where I first met him. So thank you so much for being here, Eric. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for the next portion of our program.
Thanks so much, Shay. Yeah, it's amazing. It was that long ago I was working at NCAI now. Just really want to express my gratitude to all of you for organizing this, to Bobby for that really beautiful land acknowledgement. Really gave me a lot to think about in a good way before we started this, and just so appreciate Paul being here. I have been to NAEA many times. I regularly call it one of the most inspirational nonprofits in our community. And especially when I was running the Center for Native American Youth, I just loved being able to bring our young people there to see what was possible in our communities. Most of the time I would be hanging out in the Elders Lounge because that's just kind of who I am. I was sort of born a 70-some-year-old man, but just loved seeing such an amazing intergenerational cultural space. And it was just great to hear your personal story there, Paul, and your connection and your leadership. So really great to be here. I was trying to think what would be most useful to this particular audience out in Oregon. I actually grew up in Seattle and my family's still there. So I've spent a lot of time in all of the Northwest tribal communities. But today I wanted to share a little bit about what I've kind of learned in philanthropy. So I'm going to pull up a slideshow here for you. These are sort of 5 of the lessons that I really feel like funders most need to know during my time advocating in philanthropy. I actually do another version of this presentation internally to our own people who are not working in philanthropy, because it's a really complicated and strange world to have to navigate philanthropy as a sector. It's not particularly indigenous. It's a very Western structure that was really set up to protect wealth and, really is part of the tax code. So there's a lot of translation that we have to do in philanthropy. And these are some of the things that on the national level, after hearing some of those really rich stories that Paul shared about what's happening there in Portland, I hope that all of you can take away to start thinking about as you hopefully are working towards stronger investments in our communities and to deepen your own learning journey. So I think one of the most important things that I always like to share with everyone is that we are really diverse. I think that just in Oregon alone, listening to Bobby's land acknowledgement, I hope one of the things you really take away is just how rich our cultures and languages are across this country, and even in just places like current day Oregon. We're over 574 federally recognized tribes, over 60 state recognized tribes, and many more that aren't actually recognized because they were terminated during our termination policies or for other reasons that they weren't recognized by the current US and state governments. Over 70% of us live in non-reservation areas like where NAEA is located. And that's a really important thing that I think a lot of people don't understand. We represent hundreds of distinct languages and cultures. One of the things I love to share about our organization is that we were founded over 30 years ago by a small group of Native people and Asian Pacific Islander people working in the philanthropic sector. They found each other at a Council on Foundations meeting and they huddled. And they realized that so many of the reasons philanthropy uses to justify significant underinvestment in our communities were for the same reasons, that our acronyms encompass hundreds of languages and cultures. We're always told our populations don't justify investment. And there's just significant invisibility problems and a lack of understanding about our communities, much of which we've certainly seen in the aftermath of a lot of the anti-Asian hate, for instance. And so our organizations, Native Americans in Philanthropy and Asian Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, were actually born together. And that's our origin story. And we shared our office in Minnesota for the first several decades of our life as organizations. To honor that this year, we're actually going to be holding our conferences jointly in Seattle in the summer, so stay tuned for that. But I share that because I really want to help everyone understand just how rich and diverse our communities are. And it's one of the things that I hope you'll take away as you engage with our communities. We're also one of the youngest and fastest growing populations in the country. I had one amazing job working with a whole national network of our Native youth leaders from all over the country in my last gig. And one of the things I absolutely loved about it was just the energy and the innovation that those young people brought to co-create these leadership platforms and communication platforms, but also just how grounded they were with their relatives, their elders, and their communities and culture. And that's really what represents our communities. We deeply value our relatives and relations. One of the things that I like to share with everyone as I came into NAP, we've really built out an entire framework that we call the Relatives and Relations Framework. And one of the reasons we did that is one of the strongest values that we as Indigenous people share with one another is this deep respect for how we're connected to each other. And I really realized that that's a lot of how philanthropy is focused as well, albeit not Indigenous. We're trying to bring an Indigenous view to relationship building to the sector. And that really means understanding and building trust among one another, learning from each other and what cultures and strengths and knowledge you bring to the table so that we can work together to really build power. Foundations are super complicated. They're these Western structures, like I mentioned, that are built on the tax code. And they've done a lot of harm. Our communities are very used to these extractive relationships, again, that Bobby raised in the land acknowledgement. Much of Oregon's philanthropy is built off of stolen land and timber and all sorts of things. And this is what we're used to in philanthropy. So, trust isn't often there, and those relationships aren't there. But the most important way to really change that and to do more meaningful work with us is to shift how you build those relationships, to make more meaningful relationships. I always share another example of when I've always been on the sort of fundraising side of things for the different nonprofits I've helped get off the ground really locally and some of the national ones. Trust building really takes time, and it's really hard to communicate this with funders sometimes. I used to always put in my budgets for grants community time, and half the time I'd have to have a whole back and forth with funders about, well, what does that mean and how does that connect to your outcomes? And I would always have to explain that this is a community that I don't know, and I need to go learn who they are, and I need to build relationships. And sometimes that just means taking a week to go hang out and to meet with tribal leaders and to meet with community leaders and elders. And the outcome is the beginning of a trust relationship. And so I share that because there's a lot of these things that as you have conversations with tribal communities, you really need to listen deeply about how we need to do our work with one another and not try to pigeonhole it into the wrong frameworks for how these funds go to community. As I mentioned earlier, one of the reasons we were founded with our partners at APIP was invisibility. One of the biggest struggles all of us as Native people have in whatever work we're doing is invisibility. I've spent most of my life in policy, and particularly in the domestic violence space. And, I spend so much of my time just trying to help a lot of people understand that we actually still exist. We are hundreds of nations strong. We're young and fast growing population. And so much of this just isn't even on the radar. There was a study done a few years ago called Reclaiming Native Truth that was funded through Kellogg and a few other funders. And they did a major national study of public understanding of tribes. And, most of us in the tribal world were not surprised by the findings, but it was important to look at that, most people really don't understand much beyond what they might have gotten in their middle school or high school textbook about who Native people are. And over time, that's a really detrimental thing for us to have to not just push back on those harmful and misrepresentative stereotypes, but to also have to educate people about who we really are. Not only do people often think we don't exist, they have these terrible understandings about how we do or don't receive benefits from casinos, how many of us have these kinds of things. So we spend a lot of our time having to push back on narratives and instead of having people come to us and listen. On the positive side, this has been a really exciting shift, I think, with the uprisings with all the people at Standing Rock and beyond, and some of these amazing new representations we have, like Reservation Dogs, which I highly recommend on FX, where Native people are telling their own story to, quite frankly, a mostly Native audience, but with a lot of our partners and allies listening in. We're finally bringing our own stories to bear to a broader public. And I think there's a lot of exciting things happening in that, especially as we've seen a lot of our partners in the social justice and Black and Indigenous peoples of color movement sort of bringing us in. Another thing I'm just so excited about that I like to share with philanthropy these days is this is such an exciting moment for our Indigenous leadership in the philanthropic sector. We have so many amazing elders who have been the ones who helped found organizations like NAP, who started some of the first Native-led public and community foundations, who really started new approaches to Indigenous intermediary funding. Also, though, in just the last several years, we have an amazing set of new leadership that's come out to really help challenge the sector in a lot of other ways. We have people like Edgar Villanueva, who authored the Decolonizing Wealth book and was also the chair of our board until just recently, and now has his own Decolonizing Wealth project. We also have unique organizations like Endian Collective that's created all kinds of new political and legal structures to help move money to the ground and invest in grassroots organizing, along with all sorts of systems change. I think if you look at organizations like NEA, for many years, they've actually been on the forefront of thinking about how philanthropy can help build the kinds of projects that they have, in addition to the other kinds of funding they have. So there's just a whole set of leadership out there that's doing really exciting things. And I think this is really a moment to connect with as many of them in the field as possible to help you think about how you want to increase your own funding and engagement with our communities. Another thing that I've really been trying to focus on is just the amazing power that we saw showcased in the response to the COVID crisis. I actually started my job in early February of 2020, right before everything happened. And we were pretty small back then. I only had like 1 or 2 staff. I was barely getting my bearings, heading NAP. And I'm really glad I came on when I did, because the crisis hit and we became sort of air traffic control for all these funders who wanted to know how they could help support tribal communities. For those of you who aren't aware, we were one of the most disparately impacted communities in the COVID crisis. We weren't getting the supplies we needed. We had really serious rates, especially in certain parts of the country. But the story that was behind this was the amazing way our people responded. After we'd been working through the COVID crisis for a while in just helping direct funding response, we saw a story emerge. And that was a story not about how philanthropy helped tribes or tribal communities, but actually how Indigenous communities organized for themselves and leveraged their own cultural and community power to raise and distribute resources through our networks of relatives and relations. And as we started to see that, we wanted to report out on what that really meant in our own way. And so we published a report earlier this year that you can see on our website that showed that we were able to track down in a pretty cursory way at least $32 million that were raised and distributed by Indigenous-led funds, mutual aid organizations, community foundations, all sorts of response funds. And we know that we didn't even capture all of them. And a lot of the reason that that was so powerful were the different ways that urban communities were coming together, youth coalitions that were taking to social media and traditional media and identifying ways to get resources to their community organizations. One of the most impactful things I saw across the country were our community organizations like ANEA or like a local youth center in other communities that pivoted overnight to creating elder food boxes and to providing all sorts of other resources. And this was only able to happen because funders in this moment in COVID finally did what a lot of us have been calling on them for a long time to do, which was to provide unrestricted, multi-year, trust-based funding to the organizations and the people who knew how to serve their people the best. And so we point to a lot of these recommendations for philanthropy in that report, but I just wanted to share that because we're hoping to build on that message and that story about the strength we bring to the table, and not just this typical disaster funding for, in communities that get negatively impacted. So those are just a few things I wanted to share with you, but just wanted to offer a few ways that you can all take action right now. I think, Paul offers amazing opportunities for you to invest in some incredible work there in Portland. But I also highly recommend reaching out to organizations like NAIA, because they are truly trusted leaders in our field in those regions. They have a lot of partnerships and can connect you with other organizations that are making an impact that, are part of our networks of trust. So please do reach out and build relationships locally with any of those organizations. Educate yourself. This is what we're here for. One of NAP's primary purposes in the field is to help educate the sector on our people and who we are and how to build relationships with Native-led organizations and nonprofits. We actually just launched a new Indian 101 education series in a partnership with American Indians for Opportunity. And you can find information about that on our website. We just had the first of a series of those webinars to really help give you a grounding in the history of our communities and who we are today. We also have the Investing in Native Communities platform in partnership with Candid that was really developed to help provide some of those 101 resources about who Native people are and some of the case studies and how funders are doing good philanthropy in our world. And those are just a few examples. We have a number of different networks at NAP. I would also like to highlight that we're actually launching a new Tribal Nations initiative, which is going to be a first of its kind effort to really build new platforms for philanthropy to engage directly with tribal nations and tribal leadership. One of the things as I came into this field from a policy background is I realized a lot of people are not from that background in our sector, and our tribal nations across the country are a very important part of who we are. They're our sovereign stewards of our land. They are the ones who signed our treaties, and many of them have their own philanthropic investments, yet there aren't strong platforms for building partnerships with the broader sector, for educating the sector on how some of our tribal programs are run on reservations through tribes themselves. So we're going to be sharing a lot of new resources after a national listening tour with our tribes and our tribal organizations on that program. I just wanted to highlight that since I know some of you are interested in trying to learn more about how to work directly with tribes themselves in addition to our wonderful urban Indian organization. So with that, I thank you and I'll kick it back over.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. That was some excellent information. I appreciate both you and Paul being here today. So now we're going to move into the Q&A portion of our program. I did want to let everyone know that has joined us today that I have a shout out to some colleagues that are monitoring our Q&A section. We're going to be going through some questions for Paul and Eric, and we will try to get to as many as we can. We will also try to respond if we can't get to them, and we'll try to respond afterwards. And I will make Eric's information, his slides, available after the webinar today. So you'll be receiving copies of those as well. Thank you, Eric, for allowing us to share those. So I want to start out for the Q&A. I want to look more on the macro level. So kind of the 50,000 foot view first, and then we'll work down to the micro level. So Paul and Eric, either of you can answer, both of you can answer, please share your thoughts. What do you think is important for funders to know about tribal sovereignty when seeking to invest in tribal communities?
I think first it's important to understand what sovereignty means, and sovereignty is a responsibility as well. It's a responsibility to take care of your tribal community, to offer kind of governance structure that supports the community. I would say that in doing so, that a lot of people think the federal government is there to fund these tribes, and they think that the tribes are fully funded somehow, which is not the case at all, or that the tribes have casinos. and that somehow these casinos have made tribes so wealthy they don't need help anymore. But that's not the case for most of the tribes. Very few tribes are in areas where they, have so many resources they don't need any more support. And it's just like a handful of tribes nationally. So by and large, these are mostly employment opportunities and ways to continue to give back to the community. You'll notice that many of the tribal casino have foundations to give back to the community. So I would not assume that tribes are independently funded. Their needs are incredible. I was in a meeting last week talking about the need for broadband in Indian country, and there was a lady there from Warm Springs who kept getting bumped off of the video call because she didn't have broadband. It was, it's just, the needs are incredible. They have so many needs for water right now. So I would just not assume that the tribes have it all by any means at all. And I know, Bobby, you might want to add in a little bit here too, because you work directly with the Umatilla tribe.
I would just suggest that there, of the 574 recognized tribes, that roughly a third have casinos, and so that's 2/3 that don't, that provide any kind of dividend payment to their membership. And because of the remote, especially reservations, because of the remote locations, or conversely, the densely populated urban locations, that tribes are really strapped when it comes to the ability to help their members who live off reservation. And they're also strapped to deal with infrastructure challenges in the archaic infrastructure that the United States has in general. And so if you think it's the plumbing system below the city of Seattle is old, just realize that it's worse in many of our communities, and much older and much more dangerous or precarious. So if there is a need that exists anywhere, we usually have it exponentially more or higher in Indian country.
Yeah, and I think those are great points. I shared some resources in the chat, but this is one of the reasons we're really taking time to build out this Tribal Nations Initiative, because there are so many things that I think people need to better understand about our tribes, and both the challenges they're dealing with, but also some of the unmet opportunities. A lot of the programs, for instance, that I worked with in my past role were youth programs across the country, and a lot of those are run directly through our tribes and their education departments or any number of tribal departments. And yet they were always in need of resources to do everything from leadership development to culture camps to you name it. And funders often don't understand first that there's actually opportunities to directly fund tribes as 78, 71 organizations, and we have information about that, but also to just build direct partnerships. And some tribes themselves have their own foundations even. So we want to be able to start educating the field a little bit more about this, and to build relationships with those tribal programs so that you can see how you can actually be investing in those. So would love to hear from any of you who want to learn more about that, because it's a really important unmet opportunity for philanthropy.
Eric and Paul and Shay, I think it's probably one other thing we should point out to people who are interested in listening. And I want to just say thank you for the more than 100 people who came to this session today. Wow, yay. We do not have a tax base in Indian country. On our federal Indian lands, we do not have a tax base. So in the case of my tribe, just by way of example, essential government services, fire department, police department, the EMTs, the ambulances, the language program, the energy assistance for elders, all of that comes out of essential governmental services. That's what we use the majority of our casino net revenue for, is essential government services. So the net revenue of casinos is generally the tax base of a tribe that operates a casino. Not always, but most of the time. And so please understand that that's not discretionary income that we have a lot of freewheeling opportunity to use, because the needs in our communities are so great and so deep that the discretionary funding that we do have from the net revenue from casino gaming dips deep into that well as far as we can manage it. It doesn't take care of everything.
Thank you for
I'd like
sharing
to,
that, Bobby. Oh, yes, Paul, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I'd like to add a little bit more to all of this, and just a strong encouragement to fund tribes and tribal organizations directly. So often, entities will be afraid to fund the tribes and not know how to do it. And so they go to these third-party mediators, and that's fine too. Don't get me wrong, but it's okay to fund a tribe directly or a tribal organization. Right now, foundation support in Indian country is a fraction of 1%. It's pretty low, and it's because funding doesn't go directly to the tribes, and it goes to other organizations that we have to actually compete for. So, and I've also been made aware that some people have tried it. They had a bad experience with the tribe, and well, I'm not going to do that again. And that's just one sample. Not all tribes are like that. Not all tribal organizations are like that. They have a strong ability to deliver. The organizations you see here today, Umatilla, where Eric's from, my organization, we have no problem delivering. But if you have had a bad experience, give it another shot. And just don't be afraid to fund directly too. It is so powerful when you do that because you establish a relationship with a partnership.
If I could just add to that, I think not only is funding directly, because if you're worried that the IRS doesn't know what we're doing, believe me, they do. There are nonprofits in Indian country, both urban and rural, that file 990s like other 501c3s, for example. But there are also gifts to tribal governments, because they are governments that are recognized by the IRS, are tax deductible. And we have the language, we can provide that to you to explain to you what that means. In the chat link, there is a link for what Paul or Eric referred to, Section 7871 of the Indian Tax Status Act, which allows for restricted funds, donations, and endowments. And so I would just say to everyone who's working anywhere near Indian country, NEA, any organization, I expect to retire from this job and I will not be here forever. And so we have established two funds that the Oregon Community Foundation is in charge of taking care of. And those, one is to benefit the general operations at some point when it's large enough for Temuslik. But we also have a small fund that is not in the investment pool that OCF manages, just for gifts that we can use for artifact acquisitions if that opportunity were to arise in the future. So there's many opportunities, and one of the opportunities in Indian country is to establish not only 501c3 nonprofits and direct funding to those and direct funding to tribal governments, but to help establish endowment funds that benefit these organizations like NEA that have longevity and stability and have proven themselves worthy of that kind of investment. And so whether it's through annuities or other kinds of gifts, establishing something that is a long-term investment in one of these organizations would be truly amazing, because that almost never happens in Indian country.
Thank you. You're actually alluding to, both of you are alluding to some of the questions that I have further down the list here. But Paul, you were talking about directly investing with the tribe, so sending the funds directly to the tribe and working directly with them. And so this is for the funders. And yes, as Bobby said, thank you to all of those who have joined us today. This is more for the funders. When you think about funders who are partnering particularly well with Native communities in Oregon or nationally, what are some of the characteristics of a meaningful philanthropic partnership? And do you have any recommendations on how funders can structure resources to best support Indigenous communities? How would that look?
Well, I think there's some wonderful examples out there of funders who are funding directly to Indian country. I am especially fond of the Meyer Memorial Trust. Oregon Community Foundation is another one. One of the things I like about Meyer Memorial Trust is they're flexible. And when the pandemic started, they, like most other foundations, were very flexible with the funding. Meyer Memorial Trust has visited all the tribes on a regular basis and have deep investments in Indian country. So I really appreciate their approach. I do like Group Health Foundation in Washington State. a large foundation that's giving to Indian country in a way we've never seen before, with deep investments over a long period of time, and a lot less overhead and reporting. It's a lot less busy work. We don't shy away from it, but if for an organization that like mine that has over 200 open grants and contracts, it can be very cumbersome for our staff. If we have a series of smaller grants, it's a lot. And so having a foundation or a funding entity come forward with a deep investment is a blessing. And being as flexible as possible is really wonderful too.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that. I think everything Paul mentioned is really important, and I completely agree with Meyer. I obviously don't have as good a view on the ground as you all do on Oregon, but nationally, I think we're seeing a lot of, I think, really important efforts by funders who are trying to do differently, and a lot of this is about giving up power. I think it's really hard sometimes for funders to even understand when they're exercising power, when they've been living and working inside philanthropy, and especially if it's a white-led organization. There's a lot of Native-led organizations and intermediary funders who are really providing other approaches. That's really about, if you really mean this, then it's about giving funding over to Native-led organizations that are building networks of trust, and doing this work well. So one example is the National Urban Indian Family Coalition, which is a national network of urban Indian organizations that are, doing all kinds of amazing work. We've met at NAIA many times. And they're both providing a lot of important peer-to-peer learning and technical support and policy work, but they're also moving a lot of funding to those organizations around things like voter engagement and other really important organizing efforts. But they're the ones with their membership making those calls. They're the funders are not making those decisions, and they're not telling the organizations what to do, and that funding is unrestricted when it comes through. And there's several others like that. We have the Native Voices Rising Collaborative with the Common Council Foundation, which is a unique participatory grant-making collaborative where we raise funding from a number of different funders and foundations. And we have a national network of Native community reviewers who make the decisions on those unrestricted grants to over 80 Native-led power-building nonprofits across the country, including some in Oregon. And we're actually also launching a new Native youth leadership program in that, so that we can train our young leaders about the sector and why their voice matters. And they're eventually going to be actually creating their own youth-led guidelines so that Native youth are making decisions about how to invest in Native youth organizations. So those are just a couple of examples on sort of the national level about where I think, we're trying to provide money moving vehicles, because we also understand that in philanthropy, this is challenging when you just don't quite know where to go. But there are a number of them across the country, and we love to connect any funders with those kinds of organizations that are helping do that work and give up that power.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if you want me to comment on some of the things I wish they would do differently, but I could.
Do it. Let's do it. We have time.
I have some of my, my pet peeves, I don't know if you want to call it that, but not funding indirect or overhead rate is really a challenge, because we need to have a place for people to work. We need to have a finance department. We need to have IT, and not funding that is a real problem. OCF has, I don't think, ever done that to us, but some have. So that's been a challenge. And then sort of over the top reporting requirements, especially for this, seems like the smaller the grant, the more the reporting. And is anybody going to read this? That we put together these big reports, does it really have meaningful input? And so we wonder if it's just busy work. We never hear back. We send them in, we don't hear back sometimes, like they like it or not. We got another year of funding, which is great, but boy, that was a lot of work. So I'd say those are probably the big ones. And well, we support our programs through a series of small grants, because we don't have any foundation of real funding. So it's hard work to do a lot of the fundraising to piece a program together. But when we do, it's some of these smaller grants, they have an expectation that we're going to have impact, and we need the flexibility to bring other funders to the table too, because you can't, a $20,000 grant or less is not going to change the world. But if we can give us the flexibility to bring other sources together, let us, give us some time to do that, we can create the impact. But in and of itself, these small grants are not going to change the world, but there is an expectation that it does. And then probably my biggest pet peeve is requiring the executive director to go on multi-day convenings. That's probably one. I don't know if you all have had to do that, but I certainly have. And
Eric, do you want to chime in on that piece?
You had the biggest reaction, Eric.
No, I completely agree, and I would even extend that to just in general. I mean, I always challenge funders to say, why are you asking for the time of these people and these organizations and these communities, and really think deeply about it? Because like what Paul's saying, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been taken away from, like, literally from a training like of youth leaders in the field because I had to go because a funder basically told me I was expected to be there, and it was a total waste of time. And I'm fortunate because I'm in a national organization, but for some of our smaller nonprofits, you're taking away their key staff or like half-time volunteer when you ask for that stuff. And you're asking for their knowledge a lot of the times, and you're not even really providing the support behind it. So if you're giving like a project-based restricted grant and you're asking for a lot of time, just think about how you're layering all those restrictions on what they can actually be doing to, to impact the work. So just, would want to underscore what Paul's saying there. It's really more challenging than I think sometimes people realize.
Thank you. That was a great addition to the question. It's always interesting to hear people's pet peeves. We need to get those out in the open. So I'm going to move on to the next question that we have. Traditionally, Indigenous communities are grounded in storytelling, yet the philanthropic sector is driven by data and outcomes. And can you speak a bit to the importance of both data and stories to develop greater understanding of the needs and realities of Native communities?
Mike, do you want to go first, Eric? Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll jump in.
Okay, I was going to say, in my other job at the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, one of the things that was so hard for people to understand is they were wanting to document, traditional ecological knowledge, our stories about, the people, the plants, how we relate to the earth, the air, the creator. And, we're happy to share that. And they almost always came back, yeah, but it's not science-based. And I said, well, it never was intended to be science-based or data-based. I mean, you asked us to share with you our traditional ecological knowledge, and there's some history here and some, great times to be had and, telling stories. But we built a whole science program, by the way, on the side here, based on the guidance we got from the tribes through their expression of traditional ecological knowledge. We're not the only science-based organization, or CRITVIC isn't the only science-based organization, but that's how, we formed ourselves. That's how the tribes asked to be governed. Being sovereign is relying also on science and data too. So tribes don't shy away from it. In fact, science is used as a weapon against us, and we are now fighting back with science. So, but it's all based on that leadership that we got from the tribes, which is based on traditional ecological knowledge and storytelling.
Yeah, I'll just say this is something we're really excited to be doing more work on in general, because I think everything Paul said is spot on. And we're really caged by data that isn't ours and isn't the way we describe ourselves. In philanthropy, this is especially true. So we have our partnership with Candid on the Investing in Native Communities platform, where you can look at a map on where dollars are going in philanthropy, but it so misrepresents a lot of like the community organizations and others, and who's actually getting funding. And that tells a story that isn't ours, right? So one of the things we're working on is to start building some new opportunities for Native-led organizations to come together to really think about how we want to start sharing our own data, and knowing that that data is powerful, but that we want to make sure that we're doing that in a good way and that it's based on our values. And so we're starting some early work on really listening to our thought leaders out there in Indian country who have been working in data sovereignty across a lot of spaces, from healthcare to food and seeds to you name it, and thinking about what does that mean in philanthropy and how can we start helping our nonprofit organizations tell a different story. I think the climate and conservation space is one of the most evident for us. We're doing a lot of work with climate and conservation funders because they speak a different language. They're heavily siloed. I mean, I can't even believe what I've learned about the fact that it's like a school lunchroom. You've got the coastal funders over here and the climate funders over here and the terrestrial conservation funders. And you go talk to any native person or tribal leader and they have no idea what people are talking about, because we're looking at it holistically about, how do we sustain our salmon? So one of the other issues with that is exactly what Paul said. It's on one level, it's not having our knowledge from generations back and time immemorial honored, but it's also that Western data doesn't tell the story the way we know it. And so we need to start thinking about how that is done differently. I'm finding a lot more researchers across spaces are starting to understand that a lot of what the Western data is showing is what we've always known. We're always seeing that, and whether it's the early childhood space and the effect of our language on learning, or how wildfires operate. These are all things that are starting to get shown in Western data, not proven, but just illustrated. And so we really care a lot about that. But I think that connection to storytelling really matters, because these net deficit frames are often driven by the data, and it's not our story.
Thank you. Bobby, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wanted to make sure that you had the opportunity to share if you would like.
Well, we have a lot of ways of, let me just back up. The Confederated Tribes of Umatilla, by way of example, the largest department in tribal government of about 500 employees, is about 200, over half of that is probably in Department of Natural Resources. And we're working in forestry, fisheries, wildlife, agriculture, we're every form of water, air quality, every form of management there is to take care of the planet. And so we do that under contract, we do that under grant. We don't do that usually based on philanthropy, but we have other things that are going on. So the leader of our Natural Resources Department, Eric Quimps, published a paper in Resilience Alliance, I think. And so there's a lot of work in this area. Our chairwoman just spoke at United Nations virtually on this subject. And so we have a lot underfoot. The challenge is that what we also need people to understand is that most of the time we're doing battle with state and federal agencies to protect the planet. So whether it's environmental quality, whether it's the toxicity in water, the toxicity in the air, other forms of pollution that are killing species that we rely on, the toxicity in the foods that we consume, the native foods, the pesticides in the foods that we consume, all of those are governed by regulations governed by someone else, not tribes. And so we are usually in tribal government doing battle or going to bat with other governments at other agencies to try and get people to understand what consequences there are to the actions that they're already taking. So we're not looking for new fronts. We're looking, as Eric said, we're not looking for to create anything new. We've got our plates completely full as it is. And so for people who want to support environmental work, I think the best thing to do is to reach out if you're specifically interested in a forest or a tribe, to go directly to that tribal government and find out who's doing that work and see what help is needed. The other thing I want to say, though, is that there's not philanthropy, by virtue of the way philanthropy is organized, going through organizations as kind of intermediaries to find where you can put your donor funds, means that there are some people who do some air traffic controlling, whether it's Meyer, whether it's Oregon Community Foundation or other community foundations. There are emerging projects all over Indian country. So we're starting a new CDFI, Community Development Finance Institution. There are 80 plus fledgling or somewhat mature CDFIs in Indian country. All of them need help because we don't usually have a bank anywhere near our reservations. Most people in urban communities don't have banking relationships because of the minimum balance required by most financial institutions. So if they're on the poverty threshold or anywhere near it. So I would just say to you that there's a lot of categorical behaviors besides environmental, like getting financial services and financial education to our communities. That's very fundamental and very easy to identify through the networks that are established in Indian country.
Thank you. So there's a lot of information going around. If you'll look in the chat, there are links that we are placing in there. Eric, Paul, Bobby, thank you so much for adding those. And I just wanted to, before we move on to the next question, I wanted to let you all know that we have some wonderful resources, not only nationally, but locally. So if those of you who have the questions about connecting with tribal communities, we will have a resource document that we're going to send around after this. We also have a wonderful organization in the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians focused on tribal sovereignty and self-determination. That information will also be in the document that we send around along with Eric's slides. So watch for that afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead. We have a few questions. We have several questions in the chat. I did want to address one that's a little more broad. So what does the land back movement mean to your organizations? And then how is it surfaced here in Oregon for those of you that are here?
So I'm going to launch this because I'm old enough to know that to remember Alcatraz and Fort Lawton in the 1960s. So this isn't new. People in both urban environments and rural environments have been telling churches who have substantial land holdings in Indian country, federal agencies. We have co-management agreements with 3 forests in our case. We work with the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Land Management, the Bureau of Reclamation, the U.S. National Park Service. We work with anybody we can to protect land. And rarely does anybody want to give it back that's in charge of a federal agency. But the people that are most likely in the United States to return land have been churches and people who have Superfund sites, people who want to give us back something that's already been polluted, ruined, trashed, and is a toxic waste site. And so I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, but on the other hand, thanks, but no thanks. I mean, we didn't make the mess. And so don't give it to us just to clean up. And beyond that, I would say to you that we did get in Seattle with the overtaking of Fort Lawton. I'm going over the fence there. The city of Seattle and the military installation there did create the 99-year lease for United Indians of All Tribes Foundation. Alcatraz is now under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service, so there's no longer an encampment there, but it is not the same place it used to be when it was first overtaken. But the land buyback, there's 2 things going on in Indian country, and if you've seen headlines in Indian country about land buyback, that's a specific legal settlement, has nothing to do with the land back movement. The land back movement that is prevalent in so many other countries has not taken a great deal, not had a lot of traction in the United States, and it's much more aggressively being asserted in Canada.
You know, there are some well-meaning folks and organizations out there that are trying to do good, and I don't want to dismiss that, but there are also others out there that are rather dubious. NAA was contacted a couple of years ago about giving us some land on the waterfront right near downtown Portland, and it took about 10 minutes to find out it was a toxic waste dump, and if we accepted it, we'd accept the liability for cleaning it up. So there, you know, there's that, which Bobby alluded to, but there's some great organizations out there too, and even in the Columbia River Gorge, you know, there's an organization out there that's thinking about giving some land back to the tribes or a tribal organization to benefit the tribal community, which is awesome. You know, it might be a good place for, not huge, but put some tiny homes up to get some people off, off of the riverbank and into some stable housing. So it's out there. It's good. Don't want to discourage it. But Bobby's right. It's been around for a long time. We did get the federal government to give us some land back on the Columbia River. It took legislation and many years, but we have those treaty fishing access sites that were set aside for the exclusive use of 4 tribes to exercise their fishing rights on the Columbia River. That's really a little jewel of sovereignty, but it took about a decade and a half of pretty strong advocacy. It's out there. I would welcome it if somebody wants to give NAIA's land back to to us through the form of helping us retire our debt. That's another form of land back, to make sure that it's set in perpetuity for the Native community in Portland. There's other wonderful examples around the country too, and throughout Oregon.
Yeah, really helpful. And I really appreciate Bobby grounding us in history there, because I find this is one of the challenges I've been having in having this conversation, is that, land back means a lot of things, and it's also not new, as you mentioned. I also think it's just really important to, again, educate yourself as much as you can about our lands. I mean, it's complicated for a reason, and it wasn't our fault. And the fact that a lot of our tribes don't have their lands traditionally, my grandfather was a dentist up at Blackfeet, and in several tribes in Wisconsin and Michigan, when the termination policies were happening and the federal government was just, backing out of its treaty obligations and literally telling tribes, you're not a tribe according to us anymore. And, a lot of the land back is just trying to get that land back from even the, in the 1950s and 60s. So, and then there's the urban organizations. I think, there's been some really interesting and innovative efforts in California, for instance, with the Shumi land tax and some others, to try to provide vehicles for funders to think about how to provide land to those who are not recognized, for the tribes, especially in certain states where there's, landless tribes that should have land, urban nonprofits like Paul's. But these are all complex and they're all different. And so it's really important to at least understand kind of the implications of land and our history first, so that you can know as much as you can before you sort of engage in some of these. Because I agree, there are some dubious efforts out there. Sometimes there are some that are not driven by our own people. And, as you're thinking about what that means, the last piece I'll say is that there's an amazing opportunity right now in the climate and conservation space, to be thinking about how to invest in some of these efforts, like the 30 by 30 or America the Beautiful initiative as it is now, because there's opportunities with the current leadership in Washington where they're trying to speed up our land into trust transactions, where the federal government is, buying back land for our tribes to get it into trust in partnership with the tribes. But there's also lots of private philanthropic opportunities to do that in a way that tribal leaders are already working on. So there's a lot of public-private opportunities when it comes to getting land back that are in line with our sovereignty and what our tribal leaders want to. So happy to follow up with anyone on any of that stuff from our side too.
Wonderful, thank you. I do want to touch on another question. We've talked about funders and best practices for funders working with tribal communities, and also pet peeves. Thank you, Paul. And I just want to also focus, because we do have donors that are here. It's a donor education event today, and they were wondering, how can individuals come together with others to create impact when it comes to funding? So not just the big funders and what they're doing for best practices, but what can individuals do?
So I don't know about all of the other ways, but there's a few places that have rosters. So I'll just start with the ones I know, and Paul and Eric can add to this. But I know, for example, the Oregon Cultural Trust has a list of nonprofits that you can make gifts to. Now, I will say to you, tribal governments are never listed there. So if you're trying to help, for instance, to Muslet Cultural Institute, which is a tribal department, it's not going to be listed there. Secondly, Oregon Community Foundation has donor profiles on its website, or profiles of organizations. And so that's another way to go. The other as I said before, the other way is to look at the tribe and see what nonprofits they may have affiliated or associated. So our tribe has a nonprofit associated with education. Private from the Confederacy is the Crow Shadow Arts Institute. So there are organizations that are affiliated with the tribe, some that are separate from the tribe, but on Indian lands. And so there isn't one place to get a directory, but if you wanted to get together with others, it's kind of like a book club. I would say each of you do your own homework, get together and see what it is you want to have an impact on jointly. And if nothing else, see if one of us can help you find that place you want to help.
Paul or Eric, would you like to add anything to this question? If no is the answer, that's fine too. Oh, Paul, you're on mute.
Can you repeat the question again, please?
Yes, we were talking about how individuals can get together and make an impact versus the funders that we've talked about in a more broader aspect.
Well, I think organizations like Oregon Community Foundation are a good resource for bringing people together, individuals to give. Many nonprofits and tribes have their own fundraisers. There's a way to contribute that way as well. And when you donate through that method, then you're giving the tribes the greatest flexibility with the funding to use it to the best of their needs, where the gaps are the most difficult to fill with other foundations. So individual giving is wonderful. There are other organizations out there that can help pool resources together, but usually they end up looking like a foundation of some kind.
Great, thank you.
The Native Arts and Culture Foundation was already mentioned, obviously, and the Potlatch organization and others. So there are other organizations, but it really depends on what you're interested in helping with topically for us to help steer you.
Yes, and the resources that we'll have on our website available afterwards will be helpful as well. And we're all here for you if you have any questions, reach out afterwards. So with our last few minutes here, I want to ask you, there are countless more examples of creativity and abundance in Native communities that we could go over today. But we'd love to hear another example or two. You've given us quite a few. I don't know if there's anything in particular that you wanted to highlight that's out there that donors could know, well, would love to know about or should know about here in Oregon or nationally that represent Indigenous creativity, resilience, and mutual support.
If you're interested in a specific species, a specific organization, I mean, I would just say to you, Northern California, Southeast Alaska, the Yukon, there are organizations all over this country trying to protect what the Creator gave us, and whether that's human life or other kinds of forms of life. And so I would just say to you that when you talk about resilience and creativity, a lot of the grassroots efforts that are really on the ground, sort of boots on the ground, very effective, taking care of desecrated grave sites, regardless of where it is. There are people doing all of this work, and usually the most effective grassroots people don't have time to create a nonprofit. So if you have expertise in philanthropy and can volunteer your time to help create a nonprofit or to help create an endowment or to provide technical assistance, that's another form of giving in Indian country. But I would say to you, be reminded that people have been coming to help us since the arrival of the first missionaries and the first superintendents of Indian Affairs. And we're not easily trusting at the first introduction. We're not going to dive in instantly until we know who you are and what you want to do. And so, as Eric pointed out in his 5 lessons, I'd go back to those 5 lessons and educate yourselves first.
Anything else to add in the final few minutes, Paul?
Well, I just think what Bobby said was just, well said, Bobby. Thank you. It has been just a pleasure to be here today, and I'm so glad that we had such a great turnout, and hopefully people took away a little bit more of a learning about how important it is to partner with Indian country, and it's really not that hard. We learn how to partner with, say, the state of Oregon, but I know that if I send a letter to the governor about, something related to health, it may not get answered. You got to do a little bit of research and find out the best way to find the Department of Health in a tribe, for example. So it's not that hard. Just take that first step, and you'll be rewarded with a very rich experience funding tribes and tribal organizations directly.
Yes, I just ditto all that. I know we're at time. I just want to say that I think that, again, I come back to the relationship building, because it's through those relationships with, the folks here on this call and anyone else that you start learning about and building relationship with are going to bring you to a lot of those small grassroots efforts, those organizations that are doing the good work. So that's why it matters so much, because you're going to learn a lot about some amazing people out there in our tribal communities doing this work.
Well, thank you to all of you. I am so grateful to have you here and to have your perspectives. And remember this, for those of you that are here today, this is a starting point, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. Watch for more of the resources that will come out later, and we will keep in touch and in communication. Paul, Eric, Bobby, I am so appreciative. Thank you for taking the time. Everyone have a good day.
Thank you all. You take care. Have a good day yourself. Bye.
Bye-bye.